Hey there, Lawfare listeners. Editor-in-Chief Benjamin Wittes here with a quick favor to ask. We want to hear from you to make Lawfare as insightful and engaging as possible. Whether you read our in-depth national security law and policy analysis, listen to our podcasts, watch our live streams, whether you're an occasional reader or a true superfan, your feedback is essential to helping us improve. We've put together a short audience survey, and while we know you're busy, we'd really appreciate it if you could take just a few minutes to fill it out. You'll find it at lawfaremedia.org/survey and in the show notes of this episode. Your input helps us understand what's working, what's not working, what you want more of, what you want less of, and how we can better serve you. So when you have a moment, please visit lawfaremedia.org/survey and let us know what matters most to you. Thanks for your support. And now on to today's show.
One issue with this maritime infrastructure, especially when it's like undersea cables that have been laid on the seabed, is that they were laid in the time when one didn't assume that there would be like this kind of physical threats to them, and they've been laid in a way that makes it fairly easy to damage them.
It's the Lawfare podcast. I'm Anastasiia Lapatina, Ukraine Fellow at Lawfare, with Minna Ålander, an Associate Fellow at Chatham House Europe program.
A likely result is that the authorities can never conclude that yes, there was a direct link to Russia, and they may also not be able to prove intent, because unless it's basically a crew member confessing, yes, we did this on purpose, it's just very hard to prove something like that. So often the attribute remains sort of technical.
Today, we're talking about the growing incidents of suspected sabotage in the Baltic Sea, Russia's role in them, and what Europe can do to protect its waters. So I wanted to talk to you about the topic of Russian sabotage and Russian espionage in the Baltic Sea and in the Baltic region, and specifically about the very suspicious subsea cable activities that have happened in the last 2 years. And so in the past 18 months, there were 4 specific cases that kind of alarmed the authorities and made headlines. In 2023, there was a gas pipeline and a data cable between Estonia and Finland that was damaged. In 2024, there were 2 cases of communication cables between Sweden and Lithuania, and Germany and Finland damaged as well. There was also an Estonia and Finland power cable that again got damaged under uncertain circumstance. And then in 2025 in January, so very recently, there was a data cable between Latvia and Sweden that got damaged as well. And so all of those cases were kind of uncertain because nobody knows who's really behind them, but a lot of things are pointing at Russia. Before we go into who the perpetrators might be and what this all means, I just wanted to ask, what have been the consequences of these damages? And, as far as an average civilian in these countries is concerned, what kind of impact can this have? And what were the consequences?
Yeah, so that was an excellent sort of rundown of what has happened. It has indeed been quite a lot. The good news is, though, that it hasn't really had any noticeable impact on civilian life in the countries affected. So mainly what it has caused has been reparation costs. But thanks to the sufficient redundancy in this infrastructure in the Baltic Sea, there haven't been any major sort of blackouts, or not even really slower internet when it was data cables or communication cables that were damaged in these incidents. So that shows how important it is to have a sufficient level of resilience in terms of redundance, so that you don't have just one cable, but 5 or so, and that you're you've thought about a backup plan. Because of course, disruptions can happen also actually just purely accidentally. The question of intentionality here is of course a very hot potato, but that sort of has been a very good a very good sort of like proof of resilience in the countries. However, for example, in the case in December 2024, when this ship called the Eagle S dragged its anchor over some power cables between Finland and Estonia, that could have actually been much worse if the Finnish authorities hadn't stopped the ship and confiscated it so fast, because there were like way more cables along the line that it would have dragged the anchor over, and then the damage could have been much more significant. And in that case, I would say that there was definitely an interesting element here in the sense that it was two power cables where electricity goes from Finland to Estonia. So it's like that way that the energy is going. And Estonia, along with Lithuania and Latvia, just recently, like last week, cut themselves off completely from the Russian energy grid. So there was sort of like this question of, is this somehow connected? Like, if Russia was behind it, was it trying to complicate matters or like punish the Baltic states like Estonia for this, or just like do harm to maybe postpone the decoupling from the Russian energy? So it could have been worse for sure, but so far the actual damage to civilian life, or like there haven't been many complications in that sense. It has been very limited.
You kind of leaned into my next question here, which was, how big is the potential for something more serious and impactful? Like how much of this critical infrastructure is there, and how resilient are these countries, as you've mentioned, for future attacks like this? If an actor, an adversary really wanted to escalate this and bring it up a notch, could they really do real serious damage to civilian life here? Is that possible?
Well, I would say that it sort of like depends on what is the intention here. And of course, like we do not have any sort of like proof that could be presented in a court of law that this definitely was Russia behind it. But if we just like assume that is the case, like of course one aim here could be, apart from just like waging this so-called hybrid war, so this kind of gray zone aggression that deliberately stays below the threshold of an armed conflict to make it sort of harder to do something about it, and definitely sort of like excludes any military means as a response. But so there is like sort of value in doing this now in while we're still in peacetime, like according to international law. I mean, like we are obviously in very muddy waters here in terms of war and peace. So it's not possible to say that like we're completely at peace still. But obviously, and especially since we are talking about like how does this affect civilians in these countries? So the difference that I like to make between war and peace is like, to what extent does it sort of like upend civilian life? Like if we declared that we are at war, it would mean like quite significant changes for civilian life in these countries. And that's not the case yet. So there is, on the one hand, there is value for Russia or like an adversary. China has also been involved in these incidents, to just generally cause sort of like fear, or like sow fear and uncertainty in the countries, and potentially sort of just disrupt functions of the society. But then with the view to a potential conflict later on, these attacks can provide the adversary very valuable information on the level of resilience and redundancy, meaning that now they know that, okay, cutting these couple cables is not going to do much. So it takes more to knock out critical infrastructure completely in these countries. So they would now know like how they would need to calibrate an attack if, for example, in an early phase of a conflict, they wanted to knock out some like societal or state functions in the countries in the region. So this is like one thing to bear in mind. And then, of course, as I said, like the damage could have been much greater already in December if the ship had continued with the anchor down. So we've been lucky so far that it hasn't been worse. So I would say that one issue with this maritime infrastructure, especially when it's like undersea cables that have been laid on the seabed, is that they were laid in the time when one didn't assume that they would be deliberately or less deliberately, but anyways, that there would be like this kind of physical threats to them, and they've been laid in a way that makes it fairly easy to damage them. And there's the companies who own these cables are thinking about how to change this and how to make it harder to damage this infrastructure as well. So there is, in that sense, like redundancy is good, but it of course doesn't in itself make a single cable or individual cable less prone to damage.
We've been hinting at Russia throughout this time, and it's worth unpacking that the topic of perpetrators and whether how the governments are approaching this question of responsibility here. Can you just walk us through what have been some of the investigations, theories about, is this an accident? Is this Russia? Is this China? Who is behind these accidents, and what do we know about it?
So in some cases, it's sort of easier to tell who owns the ship, for example. So in one case, in November 2024, it was a Chinese-owned ship that was sailing under the Chinese flag. So there wasn't much mystery about like who's in charge of that ship. However, otherwise, there have been cases of these so-called shadow fleet ships, where the ownership structure is usually very difficult to completely follow through to the point that you would be able to say like, okay, it's definitely this or that country or like even company that it can be attributed to. And mostly the owners of the ships don't want to be sort of like brought into the daylight because the whole shadow fleet is a shady business. So that's sort of like the purpose of the whole enterprise. And so sometimes it can be basically impossible to find, like, as I mentioned, such like court-proof evidence that, okay, it was that this could definitely be linked to Russia or to China, whatever. So in the first case with the Baltic Connector gas pipeline in October 2023, it was pretty interesting because the ship was sailing under the Hong Kong flag. But then after the incident, and when it was sailing off from the Baltic Sea along the Norwegian coast to the Northern Sea route that passes along the Russian Arctic coast, and that was its route back to Asia, it actually changed ownership to a Russian-owned company. So it was like very, very murky.
I didn't even know you could do that.
Yeah, it's like, it was very interesting how they did that. Like they had also changed the crew previously. I think it was while the ship was in Kaliningrad, in this Russian enclave in the Baltic Sea. And so that was a very interesting case. And that was also like not a very good show in terms of the response by the countries involved, because like we were unable to stop the ship and do any proper investigation there. China finally, like sometime in the fall, they actually admitted like, yes, okay, the ship did damage that cable, but of course denied that it was intentional. In this very latest case with the data cable, I think it was between Latvia and Sweden, the Swedish investigation was actually pretty quick. So after only a couple of weeks, they concluded that this was an accident. Whereas the Christmas Day Eagle S case, where the Finnish authorities confiscated the ship that was suspected of the sabotage, that's still ongoing, and we still don't have the results. The issue here, and this is quite tricky for the Western countries or the European countries that have been targeted by these incidents, because of course, like, we still value the rule of law, and for us it matters whether you can actually prove something or not. And it is of course part of this like plausible deniability, or I would actually rather call it implausible deniability, because it seems so unlikely that all of these incidents could be pure accidents. So that is like a big part of this, and makes it's very expedient for, let's say, Russia to have these incidents happen and being able to like deny any involvement in this. So a likely result is that the authorities can never like conclude that yes, there was a direct link to Russia, and they may also not be able to prove intent, because unless it's basically a crew member confessing like, yes, we did this on purpose, like it's just very hard to prove something like that. So often the attribute remains sort of like technical, like we can prove that it was this ship and its anchor that damaged the infrastructure, the cable, but we cannot sort of like attribute intent. And I think that this is something that we will have to sort of like learn to live with, that there remains this degree of uncertainty, that it's sort of like this case of like you can neither confirm nor deny that it was Russia, because you don't really have proof either way.
You mentioned Russia's shadow fleet. I think we should explain what that is and how that really works, because that the concept in that fleet is playing a huge role in Russia's war against Ukraine, in the Russian economy, and basically allows Russia to export a bunch of its crude oil all around the world, despite the heavy sanctions that have been put on Russia. So could you just explain a little bit how the mechanics of that work, and how come Russia can still export its oil on these weird ships under different flags and evade sanctions like that?
The shadow fleet is historically not a new phenomenon, and Russia is not the only one who has been using it. There have been also other states that have been sanctioned for different reasons, that have then used this so-called shadow fleet to circumvent those sanctions. So the idea is that it's a fleet of very old ships that have maybe been already decommissioned from their previous roles, and these have been bought by different companies, often sort of maybe located in some faraway islands, like, I don't know, Cayman Islands, the Cook Islands, the Eagle S, for example, that damages cable in the Gulf of Finland was sailing under the Cook Islands flag. And this is sort of like to make it harder in incidents where some damage happens, to get the investigation going, because basically, according to the law of the sea, it needs to be the flag country that conducts the investigation.
That's so interesting. That's like, the military investigating itself.
Yeah, exactly. It's like talk about like giving the hen to the fox to guard. Yeah,
exactly.
So that was exactly what happened, for example, with this Yipeng case. And with the Danish and Swedish authorities who were trying to investigate it. It was back in November last year that China then sent an investigation team to the ship according to these rules. And Swedish investigators were allowed on board, but only in an observation role. So obviously that investigation didn't yield much, and then they just like sailed off. This is like one issue here. But on the other hand, it can also be sort of, the Finns sort of used this to their advantage in the Eagle S case, where it was Cook Islands that is the flag country, because like they obviously weren't going to provide an investigation team. So then Finland said that we're doing this now ourselves, the investigation and such. And the problem here is that the law of the sea is sort of like, it is pretty vague, and there's like very little sort of possibilities for literal states to intervene because of the freedom of navigation. And of course, it is also very important for these countries to consider what kind of global consequences it can have if we start sort of like confiscating all kinds of ships and like intercepting them and so on, because like the Baltic Sea is of course not in a vacuum, and what happens in the Baltic Sea can be done elsewhere. So we can also end up in a situation where others start doing the same to our ships and complicate our commercial operations as well. But obviously it's a very different context when there's like this like sudden frequency of severe damage to critical infrastructure. So that is like, of course, a different case. And for example, right now, Finland, along with other countries in the Baltic Sea region, is looking at the law of the sea to figure out whether some new interpretation could be made of it that could enable the countries to intervene more easily, and especially earlier. Like if there already is some suspicion that like now the ship is doing some like weird maneuvers around critical infrastructure, or headed towards critical infrastructure at a suspicious speed or whatever, so that then like the countries could intervene possibly even before damage has been done.
There was a case of that recently, right? Of authorities stopping the ship.
Yeah, but so far it has always happened after the fact. So it's of course better than just like letting the ship just slip away and not even intercepting it. But of course, it would be even better if, because the question is, how can we sort of like do something about this that is more of a preventive nature and not only reactive? So like after the fact that something has happened. But then just like to get back to this overall phenomenon of the shadow fleet. So of course for Russia, the shadow fleet is incredibly important because it is a way to circumvent these sanctions on oil export. And Russia's war effort in Ukraine depends on those funds that it gets from the oil export. So this is why completely the question of intentionality in this cable incidents is actually pretty irrelevant in my opinion, because the real issue here is that Russia is using this fleet in the first place. And I found it very interesting when we had like a couple weeks ago this whole sort of debate in the media about whether this is intentional or not, and like what if it has been pure accidents, because like I don't really think that it changes anything in the need to act against it and do something about it, because even if you took a very, very sort of like good faith, lenient interpretation of this and said like, okay, maybe these are pure accidents and it's just because of the poor condition of these ships. They tend to be very rusty with insufficient insurance and with apparently very loose anchors that tend to just like drop every once in a while unexpectedly. So even if you take this kind of an interpretation, it's still unacceptable that this kind of damage happens. Like it creates costs and it can cause disruptions, and something needs to be done about it. And we need to make sure through either regulation or other means that ships that are actually not like almost not really seaworthy cannot sort of sail freely around the Baltic Sea and cause also potentially huge ecological damage if they have some more serious incident and then like there's a big oil spill or something. We had actually a close call with a ship in a Russian port just like last week where there was some heavy malfunction in a ship that had just gotten 130 tons of oil loaded on it. This is like a constant danger here. And what I would like to add to the issues, so there's of course like the hazard that this poses to critical infrastructure and the ecological hazard or the potential for an ecological and environmental catastrophe. But then a third really serious issue is also the navigational hazard, because the ships really often sort of manipulate their AIS signal, which is sort of like this location tracker signal that ships use, so that it's like not necessarily always possible to know their real-time position. And according to the Finnish Coast Guard, there were at least 4 close calls over the last fall.
Oh, wow.
With this kind of situation that the ship's location data was just like inaccurate.
This is kind of a very big question, but is there any way to like prevent the Russians from just coming into the Baltic Sea? Is there any way to, I don't know, check the ships for Russian crew members? I don't even know how one would go about doing that. But like, if we were to expel the Russian ships from the sea completely, is there a mechanism?
No, there isn't really a mechanism to do that. And one of the best examples was that Norway actually, as part of the investigation of the latest incident in January 2025, Norway confiscated a Norwegian-owned ship with a completely Russian crew. So even this kind of stuff still happens, or like it's like the last Norwegian company basically that still continues to ship fish to Russia. So there isn't really a way to do that because of the freedom of navigation, and obviously Russia is also a Baltic Sea littoral state. And I think that like any kind of idea of sort of like, for example, militarily blockading these ships from entering the Baltic Sea or something, that is not really at all feasible or like not anywhere in the realm of reality or realistic options. Also because, so for example, Finland is very dependent on transport through the Baltic Sea for its own security of supply. So about 90% of Finland's exports and imports go through the Baltic Sea. So it's actually a vital interest for a country like Finland that the Baltic Sea stays open and that our sort of like supply lines are not interrupted there. So no, we need to find some other way to deal with this. Obviously, it's not very easy, and I think that like what makes it so tricky is that it's not really a military problem. So NATO, after the Christmas Day incident, a couple of weeks later, NATO sent out a sort of monitoring operation, the Baltic Sentry. And despite this operation or this mission in the Baltic Sea, a week later, another cable was cut. So this shows that this is not a problem that can be solved or even deterred by military means. And what NATO can do here is, of course, like improve the cooperation among the countries involved, to provide capabilities to monitor critical infrastructure, like of course, like apart from showing presence. So actually it was really good. So partially the Swedish reaction to this latest cable cutting and the speed at which they were able to confiscate this ship for investigation was partly thanks to the NATO cooperation through this operation. And so that helps. It also makes it easier because like in the end, when something like this happens, it has to be a country close to the incident spot that nationally does this, like intercepting and confiscating. So when you think about like countries like the Baltic states or the Nordic countries, pretty small countries, so it's like kind of helpful to know that you have the backing of NATO to intervene like this. But then on the other hand, if we want to really find some way to prevent these incidents, it needs to be probably like legal measures, some new regulation. The EU is trying to figure out something what they could do about this, and that could prove sort of useful, because like it needs to be some kind of angle. How can you regulate against the use of this kind of ships? So I would think that there's a number of angles, like the insufficient insurance, sort of like if you have insufficient insurance on your ship, you don't sail in the territorial waters, or like or in the exclusive economic zones of some countries, or like I don't know, if the condition of the ship is too poor or whatever. I mean, like, I think that there, like, especially with this environmental angle, there could be something that could be done about this. But as was also stated so there was a NATO Baltic Sea member state meeting after the Christmas Day incident. And in their statement or in the press conference afterwards, it was also pointed out that like this cannot be completely prevented. There is no way to completely stop this from happening, because there is no way to have sort of like full control or like full situational awareness at all times. The Baltic Sea is extremely heavily trafficked, and that's why it's sort of impossible to completely get to a point that we can say like this cannot happen again. But I think that there are still ways to tackle this that could at least make it much harder and much costlier to whoever is behind this to constantly sort of drop the anchors.
All of this sounds like a typical example of something Russia is very good at, which is finding the kind of vague, weak spots of, the legislation, the rules-based order, these international norms that countries abide by, and like finding a little loophole that they can exploit. Totally. And just using that. Like they obviously know that there is so little that the Baltic states can do about it. Yes. And this is exactly why they're doing it.
Yes, exactly.
We also should mention probably the fact that it's not just the Shadow Fleet. I'm almost saying the Black Sea Fleet every time, but stop myself. It's the Shadow Fleet. They're not only using the Shadow Fleet, so the oil experts, for this kind of stuff. They're also using like fishing expeditions and fishing ships and, science-related research, quote unquote activity, which is like a whole another matter as well, right? Because there's all of this shipping cooperation happening still, correct me if I'm wrong, between Russia and the Baltic states. So some of the sabotage has also been done by a bunch of fishing sailors who are somehow protected by armed men on the ship. It's all very weird.
Yeah, so actually, because there's been also some talk about like whether this is just a direct result of the sanctions on Russia, and they are just like now reacting to that by increasing the use of this Shadow Fleet ship. By the way, the Shadow Fleet has been vastly expanded now. Like, it used to be a very manageable problem, but now it's a number of ships, like over 100 or so, that is much harder to sort of, so the potential for serious damage here is much greater now. But so, for example, one of the first incidents of a data cable being cut was actually in 2021, and that was in the Arctic. So that wasn't even in the Baltic Sea, it was in the Arctic. It was between mainland Norway and Svalbard, this island.
Yes, we should talk about that.
Yes, exactly. So that case was very interesting because that cable was severed, and later on it was shown with the help of these maritime traffic websites that monitor the movements of different ships, that it had been a Russian fisher vessel that went back and forth over the cable a number of times, and that the Nordic public broadcasters also made a whole documentary about Russia's use of fishing vessels, for example, or other commercial, like civilian ships for espionage purpose. So this is actually a very, very old strategy or like tactic that Russia has been using, like already like in the Soviet times, and it's sort of a running gag even in the Nordic countries, and for example in Norway, about this fishermen like who happen to somehow like have some dual use purposes. There was also an incident in northern Norway when some Russian seamen came on shore in military looking uniforms, which was like very confusing. Like, why would they do that? And like the Norwegian authorities had to ask them, like, please don't wear this, because it looks like really confusingly similar to some actual uniforms. So there's been a number of, and it's like sort of, it's a known fact that these vessels are used for espionage purposes. And so, yeah, there are many ways to sort of be creative here. And Russia is, as you say, very good at that. But what I think that we need to do in the West is we cannot start sort of compromising on the democratic and rule of law principles, because then we end up sort of like undermining the ground that we're standing on. And Russia's purpose is to attack the rules-based order and create uncertainty. And the trap is, in a way, that we start undermining our own rules and norms here, which is why I think we should not do that. However, we should be also much more creative about how to use the system. And I think that we need to start seeing it as a toolbox rather than like just restrictions. So there are ways of hitting back with means that are well within our own sort of framework of norms and rules. We just need to get better and more creative at finding those ways and methods.
Minna, this was super interesting. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get an ad-free version of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter through our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. The podcast is edited by Jean Patia, and your audio engineer this episode was Kara Schillen of Goat Rodeo. Our theme song is from Alabama Music. As always, thank you for listening.